Good afternoon or good evening, depending on which time zone you're joining us from today. Welcome to The Open Mind, a community lecture and film series that brings together thought leaders in science and culture for meaningful and relevant conversations about mental health. The series is proudly sponsored by UCLA's Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors. I'm Vicki Goodman, and it is my privilege to welcome and introduce today's featured speaker, Dr. Marc Milstein, author of The Age-Proof Brain. In his critically acclaimed new book that is already the #1 bestseller on Amazon in several categories, including aging, longevity, and neuroscience, Dr. Milstein shares new breakthrough science-supported strategies to improve memory and productivity, boost mood, reduce the risk of anxiety and depression, and form healthy habits to supercharge our brains. Isn't that just great? We are going to be so much smarter and healthier at the end of this hour. Dr. Milstein specializes in taking the leading scientific research on health and happiness and presenting it in a way that entertains, educates, and empowers his audience to live better. He earned both his PhD in biological chemistry and his Bachelor of Science in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology from UCLA. He's researched topics including cancer biology and neuroscience, and his work has been published in multiple scientific journals. He's been quoted breaking down and analyzing the latest research in popular press, such as USA Today, the New York Post, and Oprah Daily. He's also been featured on television, explaining the latest scientific breakthroughs that improve our life. And his new book, The Age-Proof Brain, has been nominated for the Next Big Idea Award for Best Nonfiction Work. We're also honored to welcome to today's Open Mind, Dr. Helen Lavretsky, who will join Dr. Milstein in discussion. Dr. Lavretsky is professor in residence in the Department of Psychiatry at UCLA and a geriatric integrative psychiatrist with federally funded research programs in integrative mental health using mind-body therapies. Her current research studies include investigations of novel therapeutic options for caregiver stress, mood, and cognitive disorders in older adults, and long COVID. She's the director of research for the UCLA Integrative Medicine Collaborative and the Integrated Psychiatry Program, immediate past president of the American Association for Geriatric Psychiatrists, and one of the leaders of the American Brain Coalition that includes AARP, the American Heart Association, Alzheimer's Association, American Academy of Neurology, and others. Her bio goes on, but in the interest of time, I'm going to stop here and just ask you to please be sure to look up Dr. Lavretsky and all her incredible work. And we are very grateful to both our distinguished participants for taking the time from your busy schedules to educate us today about the age-proof brain. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's program will run for approximately 1 hour, with the last segment reserved for your questions. If you would like to ask either of our participants a question, we ask that you please type it into the Q&A, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We had over 2,000, in fact, we had exactly 2,368 people register for today's program. So we may have a lot of questions, and we'll do our very best to get to as many as possible in the time allotted. The program is being recorded and will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel, which you can find on our website, friendsofsemelinstitute.org. There you'll find a calendar of upcoming events, videos from past programs, photos and videos from our inaugural Gen Z Wellness Summit that was sponsored by our Team Advisory Council, and films created by high school students for the Open Mind Film Festival that was held very recently. And now let's all get a little smarter and learn how to keep our brains healthier by giving a warm Zoom welcome to Dr. Marc Milstein and Dr. Helen Lavretsky. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. So I read your book. I've gotten smarter and healthier. Could you tell us all what sets your book apart from other similar publications?
Well, thank you, Helen. Thank you so much for hosting this. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to talk to you. I would say that I had some goals in mind when I wrote this book. And the three goals that I think I was really focusing on was one, that we're living in a time where we have so much information on this topic, but we have quite a bit of misinformation. So I really wanted to be, highly accurate, really focus on the science and what we actually know. And I actually start my book with a story about how somebody came up to me. It's a very true story. Somebody came up to me and said, I ordered those pills off of the commercial that say that they promise to boost my memory and improve my memory. And I said to the person, oh, that's interesting. What's the name of the pill? And the person said, well, it's really working. And I said, well, what's the name of the pill? And the person said, I don't remember. So that sums up those magic pills. It's not about magic pills or quick solutions. It's really about simple things that we can do a little bit at a time over time. And I really wanted it to be doable things. Some things that we hear about these days, there might be a little bit of science to them, but they're really hard to sustain. They're hard to stick to. And so these are just really focusing on what is action-based, what is accurate, what is simple. And then the last thing that I really was my goal is that it was uplifting and hopeful, and that it was a book that you could read and feel like you could, at the end, you could feel like I could do this, not like there's no way I could do these things. And I feel like I can make some steps, and I feel confident that I can take some control over the health of my brain, short-term and long-term.
I do agree with you that it helps to be hopeful. However, as society changes and ages, there's quite a bit of fear of getting the big A and the big D diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what are the true changes in the brain and cognition with aging?
Yeah, and it's understandable. Those fears are understandable. And I think the more that we can talk about it like we are tonight, the more we can talk about things that we can do to lower risk. So key things that we want to think about as our brain ages is just really understanding that as our brain ages, part of what's happening is the brain shrinks. It loses some mass. And starting around the age of 40, the brain can start shrinking about 5% every 10 years. And I know that can sound very scary, but what we do see in studies is that by doing the things we're going to talk about tonight, that we can keep our brain full and plump. That's really what we want, is to keep our brain full and plump, keep it from shrinking. And the second thing that I talk quite a bit about in my book is, and it's kind of an odd thing to think about, but keeping your brain clean. And the idea behind that is that your brain is like a factory, and it makes products every time you learn something new. It makes a connection for a memory, but just like a factory, it also makes byproducts. And these are like broken down proteins, leftover chemical reactions, and these things can build up in the brain. And there's all different types of waste and trash in the brain. And as the brain ages, our brain's ability to remove this waste and trash can become less efficient, less effective. So we talk about things that we now understand that we can do to help remove waste and trash from the brain and keep our brain essentially full and plump, keep that mass, and also do our best to remove waste, toxins, and trash that builds up to keep our brain healthier.
Okay, and what are the best ways to keep our brain clean and improve our memory and cognitive performance?
Well, thankfully, there's quite a few things that we can do now. But I like to start by talking about sleep, because sleep is something that we all do, and it's understandable that we can struggle at times, either falling asleep or staying asleep. But sleep is something that we've learned so much about through some really amazing research in how little small steps can improve the quality of our sleep. And sleep is a time when we actually take the garbage out. And so something that's really fascinating, some recent discoveries are that when you go to bed at night, your brain is very much at certain points during the night, kind of like a sponge almost, and it constricts and it squeezes out trash, toxins, and waste that build up. And it squeezes it out, and then fluid, the cerebral spinal fluid, comes up from your spinal cord and washes trash away. So if you think of your brain at night, I know it sounds a bit like a horror movie, but your brain is is dynamic in the sense that it's squeezing some garbage out and washing it away. And this is a system called the glymphatic system that it's a new, really exciting discovery. But it really highlights the point of sleep as an opportunity for us to really keep our brain clean. Also, sleep is a time when anything that we learn new during the day, and learning something new is something that's one of the best things for your brain, is just learning new information, because you take your brain cells and you make the connection between your brain cells when you learn something new. But when you go to sleep at night, essentially when you're dreaming during REM sleep, you find those new connections for those new things that you learned, and you make those connections stronger. You make your memory stronger. So if we don't get a good night's sleep, that has a negative impact on our ability to get a good night's to optimize our memory. And just to highlight the importance of this, we know that one of our big risk factors for memory loss, for dementia, is sleep apnea. And sleep apnea significantly increases the risk for memory loss, because individuals are waking up many, many times throughout the night, sometimes hundreds of times throughout the night, and that can have a devastating impact on memory. And so sleep is a time, is again, to make our memory stronger, to keep our brain clean. And if you don't mind, let's do a quick tip on sleep. And I like to tell some stories in the book, and I'll tell you one quick story. I like to tell about how Pete Sampras, the famous tennis player, he figured something out before, a little bit before brain scientists, and now brain scientists have validated what he discovered. And what he discovered was that as he was traveling around the world playing in these big tennis tournaments, he would bring with him black masking tape. And he would take the tape and he would cover up every little light source in his hotel room. Even that little red light on the TV, when the TV's off, he covered it up. And he said that if he did this, he played better the next day. He had more energy. He was more focused. And at the time we thought, oh, this is odd, but he was onto something. We're now learning about how all these lights in our rooms, all these devices that emit light, even if our eyelids are closed, these lights can interfere with our brain's ability to release the optimal amounts of melatonin, which allow our brain to get into deeper stages of sleep. And that's where that brainwash takes place. So we're realizing the importance of just our bedrooms and taking honest assessments and saying, am I sleeping in the dark these days, or is my room illuminated? And making your room a little bit darker. You don't have to get out the black masking tape. You don't have to go that far. But tonight, I encourage people, just experiment. Try and make your room a little bit darker. That gives your brain, more optimal sleep, and see how you feel the next day. We absolutely can talk about more things related to sleep, but that's a really simple thing that can be overlooked in our modern world.
There's one myth about sleep that I'd like you to answer, that as we age, we require less sleep. I personally don't find it true. How about
no, no. Yeah. So what we do see is at certain points during our life, it can change. But once we're adults, it's pretty sad that we need a certain amount of sleep, and it can vary from person to person. Most adults, somewhere between 7 and 9. Some people can get by on less, but it's very rare. But we do need sleep throughout our whole life, and we want to make sure we're prioritizing it our whole life, because it is an opportunity for us to keep our brain clean and keep our memory stronger.
Another common complaint as we age is that I don't have enough energy to do anything anymore. Is there a solution to that?
Yeah, so definitely the sleep is important. That's when we basically rejuvenate our energy, but also thinking about in the morning, getting outside for a little bit of natural light. And the studies are suggesting that just being outside for a few minutes, getting in the presence of natural light, not only helps us fall asleep at night. There's this brain clock that's been discovered called your suprachiasmatic nucleus. And when we're in the presence of light in the morning, so soon after getting up, the recommendation is just getting outside and for a few minutes. And that light essentially starts a countdown process in our brain that helps us fall asleep at night. So we're actually preparing for every night's sleep in the morning. And the reason why I bring this up in terms of energy is that, well, by optimizing our sleep at night and making it more effective, that gives us more energy during the day. We're also seeing evidence that, even on days where we might not feel like it, just getting outside, fresh air, going for a walk, a little bit of nature, we're seeing the importance of all these things that can be really helpful for our brain, and they can be boosting our energy too. We can absolutely talk about, I know we're going to talk about diet and all these other things too, but some simple things are just thinking about, even if we're feeling a bit sluggish, getting outside, getting ourselves in the presence of some light, some nature, and some fresh air, because that can be highly stimulating to the brain and help us boost our mood and our energy.
And not only that, also, yes, as you mentioned, anxiety and depression can improve in natural light and interaction with nature. I send everybody to the beach.
Yeah.
If you're in Los Angeles.
Yes.
What else can we possibly do to improve memory and cognition?
Yeah, so there's so many things that we can do. One thing that we can think about beyond sleep and beyond that morning light is also just thinking about learning new things. So if hopefully if we're learning some new things here tonight, that's good for our brain. And the reason why that's so important is there's two things that are being done when we learn new things. And when I say learn new things, I don't mean apps and brain games and things like that. What I really mean is something outside of your field of expertise, something that's new to you. And the reason why that's so important is that when you learn something new, you're forcing some of your 80 billion brain cells to reach out and make a new connection. And that new connection is like exercise for your brain cells. And people always say, what do you mean new things? And some things to think about is I like to think about it as you're cross-training your brain. So, if you went to the gym, you wouldn't just do arm curls because after a while that wouldn't look right. So you want to do a full body workout when you go to the gym on certain days, and think about your brain that way too. So if you think about a week, you could think about one day learning something outside of your field of expertise. Could be attending a talk, a lecture, a Zoom, a podcast, something just new information, reading something new, challenging your brain with new information. That's making new connections. The second day of the week is we want to think about moving in some new ways. Our balance is really tied to our brain health, and balance can be use it or lose it too. So we want to do things that can challenge our balance, maybe a new sport or, yoga, Pilates, all these things that involve movement a couple days a week, because that's tied to our brain health too. And then the third day of the week, a day or two, is really think about just being social, meeting people for talking over the things that you've learned. We're now seeing the critical importance of being social and how that impacts our memory. In fact, feelings of loneliness or isolation have been shown to increase the risk of memory loss by about 50%. But there's also evidence that people who go to dinner parties have a lower risk of memory loss. Now, you don't have to go to a dinner party, but if we think about what's happening at a dinner party, we're being social, we're being engaged, we're learning new things. And just to highlight one key point, we know that hearing loss, if it's just mild, doubles the risk of memory loss or dementia. But if you treat the hearing loss with something like a hearing aid, that risk, most of it goes away. And what we're concerned about with hearing loss is an individual might not be learning new things or taking in new information. So it really highlights this point of we want to be engaged, we want to be, challenging ourselves with learning new things, being social, and having some new movement in our days, in our weeks. So those are some really simple, fun things that we can do to help our memory.
Okay, and you also mentioned that there's something about diet, dinner party. What did they drink? What did they eat to help their mood?
Yes. So, diet is something that it can be personalized, it can be individualized, but we see a lot of data around a Mediterranean-like diet or something called like a MIND diet. There's been, almost a decade of research now that people who sort of follow these diets, they lower their risk of dementia by about, 35%. People who strictly follow these diets, they lower the risk by about 53%. And that's what we're looking for, is how do we bring our risk down, try to push odds in our favor. And what's on these foods, the MIND diet foods, is they tend to be heart healthy and they tend to be anti-inflammatory, because we understand now that our heart health is critically important to our brain health. And even if our heart isn't working at optimal levels, just a little bit, like slight dips in our ability to deliver oxygen to our brain can impact how our memory is going to work that day and down the road. So we want to eat foods that are heart healthy. We want to eat foods that are anti-inflammatory so that the inflammation isn't essentially spreading from the gut to the brain. So on these MIND diets, the things that are included are, vegetables, berries is always on the list, nuts, whole grains, if that fits with a person, fish, olive oil, things like that. It's really whole natural foods. And a really simple trick to think about is, I tell this story in the book, is that if you're thinking about, okay, what are the things I want to include and what are the things I might want to consider minimizing for my brain? I always talk about the museum in Chicago. They have a science museum there, and they took a Twinkie. If you've been to the museum, they have a Twinkie there, and they unwrapped this Twinkie about 12 or 13 years ago now. And it's sitting there unwrapped, and it looks great. It looks like you could eat it today and it would taste delicious. And that's what we're worried about when it comes to our brain health, is the foods that never spoil. It's the additives, the preservatives, the ultra processed ingredients, because those ingredients can be inflammatory in the gut. And we're concerned about that inflammation spreading to the brain and damaging the brain. So there's a lot we can talk about with diet, but just something really simple and actionable is If you're eating something and it's in a packaging and you're like, I can't pronounce any of these ingredients, is this food or is this a chemistry experiment? Those are the things we want to minimize, and really just whole natural foods most of the time. Even studies have shown like 80% of the time eating that way can have a brain health benefit. So, we're talking about these little things that can be helpful.
I study depression and anxiety in older adults, and same recommendations can go for treatment of anxiety and depression. Intake of antioxidants and fish oil, fish consumption of fish, same diets are useful for maintaining good mood. You mentioned inflammation and immune system.
Yeah.
What role does it play in aging, and what can we do to optimize its function?
Yeah, it's so important. And we're actually, seeing this term now called inflamma-aging, where our immune system can be attacking our body or our brain and doing damage. And one way I like to think about it and talk about it is, I like to think about there's these cells in our brain called microglia. And I always think about, if you look at a fish tank and you see at the bottom of a fish tank, you see those bottom feeders. And those are kind of like microglia in the brain. And the microglia are amazing because what their job is in the brain, these little bottom feeders, is they essentially scavenge around in the brain. They swim around almost like swimming, and they gobble up garbage, trash, waste, toxins. Essentially another way to keep our brain clean. But the problem is that what we're seeing is that these microglia can get confused. And instead of eating up the garbage, they can start eating up healthy brain cells. And they attack healthy brain cells. That's when we see an increased risk for memory loss. For dementia, we're seeing an increased risk, as you mentioned, for depression and anxiety, when our own microglia get confused and attack healthy brain cells. And so the question really becomes, well, how do we keep these microglia focused so they just eat the garbage, the waste, the trash, and they don't make this mistake? And what we realize is part of what's happening is that what's happening from the neck down can be sending confusing signals to the brain. So if we have inflammation in our joints or our gut, and that inflammation is spreading and is traveling through the bloodstream, that inflammation can send essentially factors that make its way to the brain, and they confuse the microglia into going to attack mode. So essentially what we're saying is, if we think of inflammation like a fire that can do damage in our body, well, it can also spread to the brain. And we want to think of those fires as things we want to put out, no smoldering fires. So just some things to consider are being aware if we have inflammation present in our body. And what's being utilized more and more when people work with their physicians is, using a CRP blood test, C-reactive protein, to measure inflammation that could be possibly spreading to the brain as a tool to measure. And also being aware of what we're eating and how diet can lessen inflammation in the gut that could be spreading to the brain, treating autoimmune conditions, chronic injuries, anything that can be causing inflammation that could be spreading to the brain and confusing those microglia is an avenue now that we're utilizing to protect the brain. So there's hope there that this is a way to protect the brain by treating inflammation.
So I practice integrative medicine, which used to be called complementary and alternative. And it is an alternative to Western medicine. What do you think Western medicine get wrong about brain aging, dementia?
Yeah. So I think that, Western medicine has done amazing things in terms of being specialized and treatments. But something to consider and to think about is that the brain is not an island unto itself. And the brain is interacting with all these other parts of our body. And because of that, it's a pathway to treat the brain. So just a couple examples of this are that we know that blood pressure, if it's too high or too low, that increases the risk of memory loss. So we want to be on top of blood pressure. We want to be on top of diabetes. We now know that one of our biggest risk factors for developing memory loss, dementia, Alzheimer's is untreated diabetes. But if you treat the diabetes, that risk goes down significantly. And we want to be on top of cholesterol. We want to be on top of all these different factors that are happening from the neck down. Inflammation we talked about. Even another example that people say, how's that possibly connected? Well, gingivitis. Gingivitis, if it's not treated, raises the risk of depression, raises the risk of dementia, because that's inflammation in the gums that can spread to the brain. So we want to brush and floss our teeth. We want to take care of our gums so that we're also taking care of our brain. So really putting together, and what you're doing is so great, is putting together all the pieces and treating people in an integrative approach. And then the other thing is considering mindfulness and considering yoga and considering all these practices, nature, and realizing that we're seeing, really strong science that these practices can have a benefit on our brain. So we know that stress management through meditation and mindfulness and yoga, and you said you'd send people to the beach, realizing that that this isn't just something that is nice, but we see strong data that it actually really does protect our brain, can help with inflammation, can help with stress management, and they're tools that we can utilize.
So what would you recommend? What new healthy habits can we all develop to protect our brain health?
So I would say that there's a couple things that can be highly impactful. And one is walking. And I would say that if we see these studies that show us that when we walk, that we lower risk for memory loss. And we're starting to realize that somewhere around 30 minutes a day of walking can reduce the risk of dementia by about 60%. And we're seeing the science behind this, that when we walk, we release something called BDNF. It's this growth factor that keeps our brain cells healthy. And within that 30 minutes of walking, realizing that, again, it doesn't have to all be done at the same time, but we're seeing some evidence that within that 30 minutes of walking at a little bit of a faster pace for 6 to 10 minutes, most days, getting your heart rate up, walking a little bit faster from where you park your car, where you get off the bus, going to the grocery store, around the office, at home. Beyond that can be great, but we're seeing a lot of protection for brain health within 30 minutes of walking, and within that 30 minutes, getting your heart rate up, even taking some stairs. If you can take stairs, a study came out just a couple of weeks ago that found that people who take the stairs, they improves their longevity, improves their heart health. We've seen studies where people who take the stairs, their brain looks more full, more plump. So I would say that starting with little habits like that morning walk, if you could take the stairs, adding things to your plate. I always like to say, like, people often say, I don't want you to take anything away. So what if we add some things in? What if we just say, if you're looking at your plate and you say, let's throw some colorful vegetables and fruits on there. And people say, well, which ones? Well, the studies actually suggest that it's the colors on your plate that have different polyphenols and different anti-inflammatory agents. So if you look at your plate and you're like, it looks like a rainbow, that's a little simple thing you can do, because that's an anti-inflammatory step to help your gut and help your brain. So I like to think about these little habits. One little thing people say, oh, how can I start a walking habit? Something that's a nice little trick for the brain is put your walking shoes by the door so you see them. You're more likely to do something if you see the shoes. Have the food out that's healthy so you see it. You're more likely to eat it if you see it. Have a bowl of vegetables and fruits on the table. And when it comes to flossing your teeth, have the floss by your toothbrush. You're more likely to do the floss habit if you see the floss. So it's using these little brain tricks to take care of our brain too, and small incremental steps, and can be helpful. And also keeping it fun. It's very hard to do things that aren't fun. So we talked about being social, learning new things. These are things that we know that are really important. And I'll give you one last tip, is don't be afraid to dance, because dancing is really good for your brain. And if you think about what dancing does, we see studies that dancing keeps your brain more full, more plump. Dancing involves music, which is really good for your brain. It's stress relief, it's social, it's moving, it's learning new things. And we're always looking for these activities that hit a lot of things on that list. If you're saying, well, I don't like to dance, well, pickleball is taking over the world. That's another one that hits a lot of things on this list. So there's fun things that are good for your brain too.
That's right. I always emphasize joy. Joy should be the guiding fun, guiding principle by how you select things that you will do to improve your brain health.
Absolutely.
My personal dementia prevention program is learning languages, as I travel a lot. So every time I travel, I spend several months learning a new language.
Yeah, one of the best things you can do.
Yeah. So, technology now and watching news are getting a bad rap as a downer for brain health.
Yeah.
AI, people are afraid of it. Can you tell us whether there's any application of technology for brain health?
Oh yeah, I think that the future is exciting when it comes to using technology for brain health. I think it's like anything, there's things we want to be careful about, and there's things that can be pros and things that can be cons. But in terms of just early detection, in terms of catching things earlier when it comes to brain health is critically important. And we talk about combining all the lifestyle factors that we've been talking about with early detection. That's something that I'm very hopeful about. So using technology, whether it's brain scans, blood tests, looking in the eyes, determining the presence of issues with accumulation of plaques or tangles or things that's weight accumulates in the brain. The thing to be aware of when it comes to technology, though, is that although technology can be great and it's allowing us to communicate right now and be together, and that's a wonderful thing, one thing that I just always like to mention is that a lot of the technology, especially with our phones, was developed by brain scientists, and it's tapping into things where it's hard to put them down. And so they can be great, we can learn and we can connect, but the light from the devices, we are aware, can have a negative impact on our ability to fall asleep. So just being careful in the hours before bed. It can keep us from getting outside, and that can be a concern. And the other thing that we realize is that just having face-to-face contact is so important for our stress management. We know that when we look at each other, we have face-to-face contact, we have eye contact, our stress levels go down. And sometimes if we're on our phones all the time, and using technology, we miss out on that. So just realizing that, if you've ever been talking to somebody and they're like, I'm listening, and you get upset. There's been some great work at UCLA about the mirror system, some great science there about how we need to have eye contact, we need to connect. It makes us build empathy and trust and makes us feel connected. And that really is important. So I think that there's a good and a things we want to be careful about when it comes to technology.
So you've given us a lot of tips and things to think about. The last question is, when should we start preventing? How early is early?
Yeah, I think we talked earlier and you said you like to think about it when you're born. And I think that's a great, I love that idea. I love the idea that you mentioned, which is from the moment we're born, we're aging, and that we want to start thinking about these things with our kids, as kids, our whole lifespan. We want to optimize our sleep, think about what we're eating, think about being engaged. These are lifelong tips. And they're things that bring, as you said, I loved your word, joy. They bring joy to our life when we're sleeping better, when we're eating good food, and we're socializing and having fun and learning new things. So I agree with your assessment that this is a lifelong habit.
Thank you very much. And I think we could go into other questions sent by audience.
Yes, we have so many questions, but before we go to the questions, thank you so much. I really felt like we were going to get smarter in this hour, and I personally feel smarter. And you gave so many important tips. And I think one of the most important is finding joy and bringing joy to all those activities. So thank you, both of you, for sharing all your incredible knowledge with us. I am going to go to the questions now. There are a lot of questions about sleep, and I'm going to try to sum them up. Several are about menopause, women and menopause and sleep. There is a question about using drug-assisted sleep. How does that affect brain health, taking something like trazodone for a long term? There is a question about melatonin and sleep. So I think sleep is on a lot of people's minds, and I wonder if you could just address that a little bit further.
Sure. Yeah, I can take some, and Helen can take some too. I'll start with the melatonin question. So melatonin is important in terms of our brain releasing melatonin to help us fall asleep. And one of the most common questions is, what about these melatonin supplements? And the thing with melatonin supplements is we just want to be aware that there is some conflicting data and controversy there. So the things to be aware of when it comes to melatonin supplements are that it's not very closely regulated by the FDA. So the concern is, what's the quality of the melatonin? They've actually done studies where they take it off the shelves and there's either too much or too little or other things in there. The second concern is that melatonin can interfere with other medications someone is taking. And then the third concern is that long-term use of melatonin, there's some evidence it could interfere with the brain's ability to make its own melatonin. So for those reasons, we're saying, how about a second line of defense under the care of a doctor, making sure it's being used properly? And we've learned so much about how the brain works that our melatonin system is often regulated by that morning light. Getting that morning light helps regulate the system. The hour before bed, taking a break from all those devices, because the blue light from those devices can suppress the melatonin before bed. And then really, as we talked about, making your room a little bit darker. There's some interesting studies that are suggesting that, getting about 5 hours of real darkness at night allows that melatonin to flow. Most people need more than 5 hours of sleep, but really thinking about your bedroom, am I getting 5 hours of real darkness at night? And really turning to those things first and optimizing our sleep through what we've learned about how the brain works. We can also talk about, temperature in our bedroom, making our room a little bit cooler can help us fall asleep, especially as the summer's coming. Before bed routines, mindfulness before bed, all these things can be effective. If someone's still struggling, then melatonin can be used, but we just want to be more careful. And especially we're seeing, higher usage with kids and higher levels of usage. We just want to be really careful and think about what can we do before we turn to those melatonin supplements that can be helpful with sleep as more of a second line of defense as opposed to a first line of defense.
Thank you.
Can I just add?
Yes.
I am a geriatric psychiatrist. I do prescribe trazodone to people. If the dilemma is to not sleep and not take anything versus sleep and take something, I would still take something and sleep because that's more important. And trazodone is probably the most innocuous medication that could be taken long-term without developing any significant problems, even in a small dose. But I agree that I would try everything else before I get to medications, including aromatherapy and warm baths and the salts and smelling good smells and listening to quiet music and breathing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And there are a couple of questions about menopause and how that affects sleep. Helen, I'm wondering if that's something you could address.
It does affect sleep, and you have to start preparing to go through menopause several decades before you reach menopause in order to develop this resilience and understand what the risks are, diet included. For instance, I ask women to get off caffeine and reduce yes, to improve their sleep. I mean, and reduce the amount of hot flashes. The reason the sleep is impaired is mostly because of hot flashes at night. So I would go through dietary modifications, reducing dairy and sugar and flour and caffeine in order to reduce hot flashes. And then I work with everything else, like we discussed, that all of that will apply.
Thank you. There's also another question about if you have sleep apnea, which you mentioned that earlier in your talk, if you use a CPAP, can that help reverse some of the symptoms of dementia?
Yeah, I can start here, and then Ellen can also talk. But we do see these interesting studies that show that when sleep apnea is treated effectively, there is some reversal to damage done in the brain. So it's really interesting that sleep apnea can cause damage in the brain that looks like a buildup of waste in the brain. And when CPAP machines are used effectively, or treatments for sleep apnea are done effectively, and we see in brain scans that the damage has some level of reversibility. So that's very hopeful. And that's why treating sleep apnea is so critically important.
Thank you. Helen, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I agree. We see a lot of improvement with CPAP use in the brain health and even small strokes. So sleep apnea presents on MRI like small strokes. They may be reduced and disappear. So plumping up the brain would improve with oxygenation given loaded by CPAP.
Thank you. Speaking of plumping up the brain, there is a question here. If the brain shrinks, can it rebuild?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And that sleep apnea is a perfect example of that we do see that it's not inevitable and there's things we can do. And the things we're talking about are those things that are so important.
I study yoga, meditation, Tai Chi, music, all of it, if done constantly. And we do recommend changing up activities because they activate different parts of the brain.
Yeah.
And try different new things because new learning really plumps up important memory centers. So, the more you do, the better it is for brain health and exploring new things, not just.
Yeah.
There's a question here about online games such as Wordle, crossword puzzles, connections. You can tell I play all of these things. Do those help the brain, or are they just a fun thing to do that keep you kind of stimulated?
I think I'll reiterate what Helen said, which is they can be a piece, but we don't want to say they're the only thing. And I think what Helen said is exactly correct, is that we want to think about variety. That cross-training your brain idea is that if you're enjoying those puzzles and you're having fun doing them, then that's something to do. If you don't like doing them, you don't have to do them, but it's about finding the things that you enjoy and that are fun and that are causing your brain to be challenged. So if it's a foreign language, a musical instrument, dancing, it's newness and trying new things and challenging the brain in new fun ways.
In the dementia prevention world, the movement now is to try several things administered at the same time. So you do Wordle, but you're bicycle, biking at the same time.
Yeah, I like to say, when I talk about the cross training, I always like to think that, if you're one day of the week, you're learning something new, the other day of the week, you're meeting a friend, well, go for a walk with your friend and talk about the thing that you're learning. So it's combining things can be really helpful too.
We have a question here about multitasking and brain health.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of us multitask because we've got the technology here and we've got our phones here. And so can you comment on that?
Sure. Well, when it comes to multitasking, there's definitely times in the day where multitasking is important. But in those moments where you really want to remember something, a recommendation is to really focus on one thing at a time for a few extra seconds. And there's some really interesting research about how this part of your brain called the hippocampus works, and it takes in new information. And if we're multitasking or we're distracted, that part of the brain can often just kind of throw the information away. And so, you have this experience where you meet somebody and you want to remember their name and they tell you their name and it disappears. Well, it's gone. And you think about, well, what happened in those moments after they told you their name? You might have thought about something else. Are they looking at something in my teeth? You're distracted by all these other things, as opposed to taking an extra moment. And I always like to share a silly tip, which is right after someone tells you their name, imagine writing their name on their forehead. And why does that silly trick work? Because you're focusing on their name for a few extra seconds. You're not multitasking. And that can tell your brain, oh, this is important information. And it can be then processed in a way where it's transferred to like long-term memory storage as opposed to just throwing it away. So I would say when it comes to multitasking, it can be okay sometimes, but in those moments you want to remember, consider one thing at a time for a few extra seconds.
Thank you. Helen?
I agree.
Okay.
I just injured myself because I was in multitasking. So you have to know your limitations, how much multitasking you can take.
Lots of questions here about drugs, wine, red wine, yes or no. Can you comment on that? Marijuana. There's so many questions here about usage of drugs and alcohol and brain health.
Helen, do you want to go first?
Yes. So in the aging community, brain health community, the concern now is that even a little bit of alcohol, like we used to say, 1 glass of wine, 2 glasses of wine for men, 1 glass for women, is too much of a toxicity because brain atrophy does occur with alcohol consumption. Any kind of mind-altering drugs will alter your mind. That's why they're called mind-altering drugs like marijuana. If you want to achieve acuity and full awareness, try to avoid unnecessary medications or drugs.
Yeah, I agree completely. When it comes to alcohol, the only caveat is that there is sometimes conflicting research. The MIND diet that we talked about, that diet included 1 glass of wine. But I think that when it comes to alcohol, we want to be really careful and go a step further and talk to our personal doctor about, do we have any underlying issues? Do we have any chronic conditions? Because yes, there's studies that maybe alcohol in moderate amounts might be beneficial. Then there's evidence that it might not be beneficial. And mainly that might be based upon some genetics, some individual aspects. So just taking a step further and really thinking about the totality of one's diet, thinking about, whole natural foods most of the time as something that we think about, it can be, very protective for brain health. And definitely when it comes to mind altering drugs, that's definitely a concern for when it comes to brain health.
Somebody's asking here about ketamine and psilocybin.
They can be useful for treatment of depression. Like ketamine is approved, actually, some of the forms of ketamine for treatment of treatment-resistant depression. I am personally very concerned about the widespread use now, because they are mind-altering drugs, and there are not too many psychiatrists on this earth to take care of everybody whose mind is altered. They do have a place, I think, and certainly have demonstrated some neuroplastic effects in the brain, but their use has to be specific to the, let's say, some kind of psychiatric disease or chronic pain. Ketamine is used for management of severe chronic pain.
Yeah, I also think that the research, I agree that there's a place for it, and the research is interesting and it's emerging. I think the concern also is when people hear this and then they start taking it upon themselves, microdosing or experimenting, and that's very concerning. So as Helen said, like, these have very specific places under the care of physicians in very specific studies, for very specific causes, as opposed to just, hearing about something like ketamine or mushrooms and things like that and saying, oh, that's going to be something that I could utilize, and experimenting on oneself. There's a concern, obvious concern there.
Let's see, we have one question here. I'm just going to read. I was told that a CT scan of my brain showed the, quote, normal signs of aging. What changes normally occur in our brains as we age? And you've talked about the plumping and the shrinking. What else would show up on a CT scan that would cause somebody to say you have normal signs of aging in that scan?
Microvascular disease is considered to be age normal or age appropriate, but it's rare. So the radiologists and neurologists don't get excited about small things. Geriatric psychiatrists do get concerned, and neuropsychologists as well, because this little dots, sometimes we call it Swiss cheese, like, occurrences, unidentified bright objects, identifying microvascular disease, like your heart. Brain is subject to these little strokes or little places of ischemia. They will translate into inability to multitask or executive dysfunction and memory loss, even the small dots. And those are losses that we experience with aging in cognition that are attributable to shrinking and those little dots and some inflammatory processes in the brain with aging.
Thank you. There's a question here for Dr. Lavretsky. Have you had any senior patients who have had, I know you study long COVID, developing ME-CFS?
Yes, chronic fatigue syndrome. Yes, long COVID is notorious. It's a fraction. It's not all of the long COVID that present with chronic fatigue syndrome. But we just actually submitted a paper comparing ME-CFS due to long COVID to non-long COVID ME-CFS. And symptomatically, these patients are identical. So you would say that long COVID patients develop ME-CFS-like symptoms. And we do treat this patient. Many of the things we discussed today I use in treatment of long COVID patients. I have a long COVID clinic and integrative psychiatry clinic.
There is one question here about the brain fog from long COVID. I wonder if you could address that.
It's a subjective, yes, and the brain fog refers to the subjective feeling of strained thinking, unclear thinking. They cannot arrive to the same decision before it didn't take them time. So it takes longer and it's foggy, unclear thinking. I do treat it with some vitamins and supplements, some of the mind-body techniques, and some of the medications that are developed for Alzheimer's disease, like memantine, that I personally had studied in a clinical trial for older adults with cognitive impairment and depression, and it showed an amazing improvement in brain neuroplasticity, but also gene expression in terms of reducing inflammation and improving neuroplasticity. And I'm not the only one who does this. Actually, the long COVID field adopted the use of memantine for brain fog.
Thank you. Fascinating. I'm trying to find, there was another question related to this, and I just can't seem to locate it right now.
Can I just answer? I'm looking at the questions. There's a
Okay,
question
okay,
about grief. I lost
that's
my
the one I
parent.
was looking for, the
Okay.
grief. Thank you.
Right. So grief, especially prolonged grief, is similar to really prolonged depression and stress. So what happens with depression and grief, the same cortisol, the stress hormones emit in the body, increased levels of cortisol, inflammation, and stress substances that stress the brain. And with that also affect brain structure and result in shrinking hippocampal volumes that are important for memory function and emotion regulation. So yes, these things, mood and anxiety, can contribute to risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and dementia.
But
It's important to treat it, not to leave it alone.
because at some point in our lives, we're all going to grieve something. So we need to be really aware of what to do to help it so that it doesn't affect our brains permanently, right?
Right.
Okay. So can we summarize some of these to-do things that you have given us in this hour, that so people can have a moment to take some notes and write them down? We've talked about walking, and you've talked about taking the stairs. There was one thing you haven't mentioned, and I'm wondering about, that brings a lot of people joy and also gets people out walking first thing in the morning, and that's our dogs.
That's right.
So, yes, I mean, if we're not out in our household first thing in the morning walking, we have a problem. So I'm just wondering, and how is that advice that you ever give patients, that when you really want them to try to get out, get a dog? You know, it helps you go for regular walks, and it also helps you meet a lot of people.
Yeah, pets, dogs, great for the brain, great for your health. I always like to talk about this. Just two quick things about pets is that they did a study with emergency room doctors who are under a lot of stress, and they brought dogs in and they had them pet the dogs for like 10 minutes and their stress levels just plummeted. So there's something about just being in the presence of pets. And also one other thing is that I always find interesting is that there was a study where they took, and they actually, a neuroscientist trained his dog to go into a brain scanner. And we know that, you know, when we look at our pets, we know as humans, we look at dogs, their parts of our brain light up that make us feel close. It's like oxytocin release, we feel close to the pet. But when the dog looks back at the human, those same things are released in the dog's brain. So the dog has that same closeness to the human, which is, I know people have dogs say, I didn't need a brain scan to tell me that, but the dog isn't just there for the treats and the food. The dog has that connection, and there's something very powerful about that connection between pets and humans, and it can be so good for our brain.
Thank you. Mine is right at my feet right here. I will be sure to relay all that to him. I think we have gone through most of the questions. Let's see. Any books that you recommend besides, we know we need to get your book, Marc. Any other books? I know you've written other books before. Can you just talk a little bit about books that, okay, we have a question about books and a question about supplements. And those, I think, after that, we will be out of time. So can you talk about supplements and talk about books that people might want to read about aging, including Marc Milstein's books?
Mm-hmm. So I'll do the supplement question. So supplements, we just want to be careful with supplements because there's a lot of marketing there. They definitely cases where they can be utilized responsibly, especially when somebody's deficient. So I would say just a very mainstream recommendation is have a communication with your physician, get a blood test. If someone's deficient, first talk about food, because We see absorption with food can be very helpful, very optimal. But if somebody's still struggling, then supplements can be used. But just being aware that just taking a supplement because you hear that that's the thing to be taking can be problematic. Because, for example, if someone's deficient in vitamin D, for example, that actually can cause issues with brain function. But if vitamin D levels get too high, that can cause brain function issues as well. So just taking that extra step and having that personalized approach with one's physician to say, am I deficient in anything? How do I address it? Is it food? If I have a supplement and I'm taking it, just making sure one is going back and checking to make sure those levels aren't getting too high. Because I know, we're all looking for that magic solution, but sometimes those things can do more harm than good. But again, they can be utilized, but they just want to be utilized very specifically for certain individuals in certain cases.
Thank you. What about not a supplement, but using a fresh herb like turmeric?
Yeah.
Not a turmeric pill, but the fresh root, braiding it into something. Does that still count as a supplement, or is that using a fresh herb to enhance your well-being?
Yeah, I use turmeric everywhere in each dish, and I drink tea of ginger, fresh ginger, turmeric and lemon every day. I feel better, like my digestion improves. I'm hoping to reduce my inflammation as well.
Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you both enough. This has been really an enlightening and inspiring conversation. You've given us so many important tips, so much great information to incorporate in our lives and unpack and think about as we go out for our morning walks, as we darken our rooms when we go to sleep, as we cool them off. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and make us healthier and smarter and live really great, productive, good, healthy lives. So thank you. And thank you everybody who tuned in for the privilege of your time. I'm not going to go through all the programs that we have coming up, but go to our website, friendsofseminalinstitute.org. And if you want to hear this again, the video will be up tomorrow morning, so you can watch this again and write down all these important tips. So good night, stay safe, stay well, stay healthy in your brain, and good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. I appreciate it.
Thank
Best
you.
of luck.